June 6, 1944, 06:15 hours, the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria. Major General Alfred Jodl stood in the hallway outside Adolf Hitler's bedroom door and felt his stomach tighten with a fear that had nothing to do with the Allied invasion currently underway 300 miles to the west. In his hand, he held decoded teletype messages from Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's headquarters in France. The messages were unambiguous. Thousands of Allied ships had appeared off the Normandy coast before dawn. Paratroopers had dropped throughout the night. Naval bombardment had begun at 05:30 hours. Landing craft were approaching the beaches. This wasn't a probe or a raid. This was the invasion. But Hitler was asleep. Had been asleep since approximately 0400 hours, when he'd finally dismissed his staff after another of his marathon late-night monologues about architecture and Wagner. And Jodl, a senior Wehrmacht officer with decades of military experience, a man who had faced enemy fire on multiple fronts, was terrified to knock on that door. He'd seen what happened to officers who disturbed the Führer's sleep for matters Hitler later decided weren't sufficiently urgent. Screaming tirades that lasted for hours, immediate dismissal from positions held for years. In some cases, worse consequences. Officers who displeased Hitler had a way of finding themselves reassigned to the Eastern Front, where the meat grinder of the Soviet advance was consuming German units at catastrophic rates. So Jodl stood in the hallway and waited. And while he waited, history was being written on the beaches of Normandy. Every minute of delay was a minute the Allies used to establish footholds, to bring more troops ashore, to move inland from the beaches. The window for effective German response was closing with mathematical precision, measured not in days, but in hours and minutes. And the one man who could authorize the movement of Germany's Panzer reserves, the armored divisions that might still push the invasion back into the sea, was sleeping. Let me tell you about what Hitler said when he finally woke up and heard that D-Day had begun. Not because his words were particularly profound or historically significant in themselves, but because his reaction, his interpretation of events, and most critically the delay caused by his sleep schedule and command structure, represented a catastrophic failure of military leadership that can be quantified with mathematical precision. Because on June 6, 1944, the fate of Nazi Germany was not decided by the courage of soldiers on beaches or the effectiveness of weapons systems. It was decided by a 6-hour delay that transformed what might have been a costly Allied landing into an unstoppable invasion. The story of why Hitler slept through the most important 6 hours of World War II begins not on June 6th, but months earlier, when Hitler's daily routine had evolved into a schedule that made effective military command nearly impossible. Hitler typically went to bed between 0300 and 0500 hours. He was a notorious night owl who kept his staff awake until the early morning hours while he delivered monologues on topics ranging from military strategy to his theories about art, architecture, race, and history. His inner circle men like Martin Bormann, Joseph Goebbels when he was present, and various military adjutants were expected to remain attentive throughout these sessions, regardless of how late the hour or how disconnected Hitler's rambling became from immediate military necessities. After finally dismissing his staff in the early morning hours, Hitler would sleep until noon or later. This wasn't an occasional pattern. This was his daily routine, consistent enough that his staff planned around it. Morning meetings were impossible. Urgent military decisions during morning hours had to wait until Hitler woke up. The entire command structure of the Wehrmacht, the combined German armed forces, was constrained by one man's sleep schedule. This routine had military consequences that extended beyond simple inconvenience. Modern warfare operates on compressed timelines where hours matter enormously. An armored division that begins moving at 600 hours can cover 50 to 80 kilometers by noon, depending on road conditions and fuel availability. That same division ordered to move at noon will cover the same distance by 1800 hours. The 6-hour difference in start time can determine whether the division arrives before or after enemy forces have consolidated their positions, whether it attacks while enemy troops are still disorganized from landing, or after they've established defensive positions with anti-tank weapons and artillery support. But Hitler's staff had learned through painful experience that waking him for matters he subsequently deemed insufficiently urgent resulted in consequences that made the risk unacceptable. Officers had been relieved of command for interrupting his sleep. Others had faced lengthy tirades about their judgment and competence. The informal rule that emerged was clear: unless the situation was literally apocalyptic, let the Führer sleep. June 6, 1944 would test whether an Allied invasion of France qualified as apocalyptic enough to justify the risk. The first reports of unusual Allied activity reached German intelligence around 0100 hours. These initial reports were fragmentary and difficult to interpret. Increased radio traffic, reports from radar stations of unusual aircraft activity, coastal observers reporting engine sounds offshore. Nothing definitive yet, but enough to suggest something significant might be developing. By 0200 hours, reports were becoming more specific. Parachutists had been spotted landing throughout the Normandy area. This was unusual but not unprecedented. The Allies had conducted airborne operations before. German commanders in France began alerting their units and calling for reconnaissance to determine the scale of the airborne landings. At 0309 hours, the German 716th Infantry Division, defending a portion of the Normandy coast, sent a priority message to 7th Army headquarters, reporting that naval bombardment had begun. This was the first definitive indication that a landing operation was underway. The 716th Division commander requested immediate reinforcement. At 0400 hours, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in the west from his headquarters near Paris, was briefed on the situation. Multiple divisions were reporting naval bombardment along the Normandy coast. Parachute landings had been confirmed across a wide area. This wasn't a raid. This was an invasion. Von Rundstedt immediately requested authority to move 2 Panzer divisions, the 12th SS Panzer Division and the Panzer Lehr Division, toward Normandy. These divisions were the closest armored reserves to the invasion beaches. They could potentially reach Normandy by mid-afternoon if orders were issued immediately, but von Rundstedt lacked authority to move these divisions on his own initiative. They were part of the strategic reserve controlled directly by Hitler through the German High Command, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or OKW. Only Hitler could authorize their movement, and at 0400 hours, Hitler had just gone to bed. Von Rundstedt's chief of staff contacted OKW headquarters to request authorization to move the Panzer divisions. He was told that this decision required the Führer's approval, and the Führer was asleep and had left orders not to be disturbed. This was the moment when the mathematical calculus of the invasion was determined. The Panzer divisions were approximately 250 kilometers from the Normandy beaches. German planning assumed that armored divisions could sustain movement at approximately 40 kilometers per hour under favorable conditions. In practice, actual movement speeds were slower due to the need for reconnaissance, route planning, fuel stops, and avoiding congested roads. A realistic estimate for moving a Panzer division 250 kilometers was 8 to 10 hours. If orders had been issued at 0400 hours when von Rundstedt requested them, the leading elements of the Panzer divisions could have reached the invasion beaches by 1400 to 1600 hours. At this time, Allied forces would have been ashore for approximately 9 to 11 hours. They would have established beachheads, but might not yet have fully deployed their anti-tank weapons and artillery. Most critically, they would not yet have achieved air superiority over the battlefield. Allied fighters were operating from England, which meant their time over the battlefield was limited by fuel capacity. A German counterattack beginning at 1400 hours, with fresh Panzer divisions hitting beachheads, where Allied forces were still organizing, might have been able to reach the beaches and engage landing craft bringing in follow-on forces. Whether this counterattack would have succeeded in pushing the invasion back into the ocean is debatable, but it would have been Germany's best chance, the optimal window where Allied forces were ashore, but not yet fully established. If orders were issued at 1000 hours, 6 hours later than von Rundstedt requested, the Panzer divisions would reach the battlefield by 1800 to 2000 hours. By this time, Allied forces would have been ashore for 14 to 16 hours. They would have deployed anti-tank weapons throughout the beachhead. Artillery would be positioned and registered on approach routes. Most critically, the Allies would have complete air superiority, with fighter bombers operating continuously over the battlefield. A German counterattack arriving at 1800 hours would be advancing across open terrain against prepared positions while under constant air attack. The mathematical probability of success would be dramatically lower. The 6-hour difference between 400 hours and 1000 hours was the difference between a counterattack that might succeed and a counterattack that was nearly certain to fail. And that 6-hour window was consumed by Hitler's sleep and his staff's fear of waking him. Major General Jodl wasn't the only officer who understood this mathematics. At Field Marshal von Rundstedt's headquarters, staff officers were calculating arrival times and comparing them to intelligence estimates of Allied buildup rates. They knew that every hour of delay increased the probability of failure geometrically. At 7th Army headquarters, General Friedrich Dollmann was receiving reports from divisions all along the Normandy coast and requesting immediate armored support. At Panzer Group West headquarters, General Leo Geyer von Schweppenburg was preparing movement orders for his divisions, waiting only for authorization from OKW. All of these officers at multiple levels of the German command structure understood that speed was essential. All of them lacked authority to act without Hitler's approval, and all of them knew that Hitler was asleep. At 0530 hours, as naval bombardment intensified and the first landing craft approached the beaches, OKW staff officers held a conference to decide whether the situation warranted waking Hitler. The arguments were predictable. Some officers argued that an Allied invasion was clearly significant enough to justify waking the Führer immediately. Others argued that until the situation was clarified, until they knew whether this was the main invasion or a diversion, waking Hitler risked his anger if it turned out to be a secondary operation. The debate revealed the paralysis that Hitler's command style had created. Officers were more concerned about Hitler's reaction than about the military necessity of immediate decisions. The command structure had evolved to prioritize avoiding Hitler's displeasure over making tactically sound choices. This wasn't cowardice in the conventional sense. These were experienced officers who had demonstrated courage in combat. But Hitler's unpredictable rages and his willingness to destroy careers arbitrarily had created an environment where personal survival often meant waiting rather than acting. The conference concluded that they would wait until 800 hours. By that time, the situation should be clearer. They would compile all reports, prepare detailed briefings, and present Hitler with a complete picture when he woke naturally. This seemed like a reasonable compromise. It acknowledged the military urgency while avoiding the personal risk of waking Hitler unnecessarily. What this decision failed to account for was that Hitler wouldn't wake at over 800 hours. He would sleep until nearly 1000 hours, and even after waking, he would require time to bathe, dress, eat breakfast, and attend to personal matters before he was ready to receive military briefings. The effective delay would be not 4 hours, but closer to 6 or 7 hours. While Hitler slept, the invasion proceeded with the mechanical precision of an operation that had been planned in minute detail for months. The Allies weren't improvising. They were executing a plan where every unit had specific assignments, where timing was calculated to coordinate naval gunfire with aerial bombardment with infantry landings. The first waves hit the beaches at 0630 hours. By 0700 hours, thousands of Allied soldiers were ashore, despite heavy casualties at some beaches, particularly Omaha Beach, where German defensive positions had survived the preliminary bombardment largely intact. By 800 hours, when OKW staff officers had initially planned to wake Hitler if he hadn't woken naturally, the Allies had over 20,000 troops ashore. Beach obstacles were being cleared. Engineers were creating paths through minefields. Artillery was being landed. The invasion was succeeding, though at heavy cost at some locations. By 0900 hours, the beachheads were beginning to link up. Units that had landed on separate beaches were making contact with each other. The Allied position was becoming consolidated. German defenders were fighting effectively in some locations, but lacked the strength to push the invaders back to the beaches. The defenders needed reinforcement, needed armored support, needed immediate counterattack before Allied positions became too strong. At 09:45 hours, Hitler woke naturally. He went through his morning routine without unusual haste. Nobody had woken him early. Nobody had communicated that the invasion he'd been expecting for months was actually underway, and had been underway for over 5 hours. This wasn't because his staff was trying to deceive him. It was because they'd made a calculated decision that waiting until he woke naturally was less risky personally than waking him early and facing his displeasure. At approximately 10:15 hours, Hitler was finally briefed on the situation in Normandy. The briefing was comprehensive. Staff officers presented reconnaissance reports, tactical maps showing Allied landing locations, strength estimates based on the number of ships observed, and preliminary casualty figures. The briefing made clear that this was a major operation. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of troops already ashore. Airborne landings securing key objectives inland. Hitler listened to the briefing. Then he said something that would haunt German commanders for the remainder of the war. He said it was a diversion. The real invasion would come at Pas de Calais. This assessment wasn't random or irrational. Hitler had convinced himself months earlier that the Allies would invade at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. The distances supported this conclusion. Calais was only 35 kilometers from England compared to Normandy's 180 kilometers. Logistics favored the shorter crossing. Calais provided more direct routes to Germany. From a purely geographic standpoint, Calais was the logical choice. But Hitler's conclusion wasn't based solely on geography. It was based on intelligence reports from German spies in England. These reports had been describing massive Allied buildup across from Calais for months. Aerial reconnaissance had photographed enormous camps, vehicle parks, supply dumps. Radio intercepts had identified multiple divisions, including the 1st United States Army Group, commanded by General George Patton, who German intelligence considered the Allies' most capable commander. What Hitler didn't know was that everything his intelligence services had reported about Calais was false. The camps were fabrications, the vehicles were inflatable dummies, the supply dumps were camouflaged empty fields, the radio traffic was scripted. Even Patton's presence was part of the deception. This was Operation Fortitude, the most successful strategic deception operation in military history. Understanding why Hitler believed so completely in the Calais threat requires understanding the sophistication and scale of Operation Fortitude. This wasn't a simple attempt to mislead the enemy. This was a comprehensive, multi-layered deception campaign that had been ongoing for months, and that involved thousands of people creating and maintaining an entirely fictional military force. The operation began in early 1944, when Allied planners recognized that Germany had sufficient forces in France to defeat an invasion if those forces were concentrated at the actual landing site. But if German forces were dispersed to defend multiple possible invasion sites, no single location would have enough defenders to stop the landing. The challenge was convincing Germany to defend the wrong location with significant forces. Pas de Calais was the obvious choice for deception. The geography supported it. Calais was 35 kilometers from Dover across the narrowest part of the English Channel. Normandy was 180 kilometers from England. From a purely logistical standpoint, Calais seemed the rational choice for invasion. Shorter sea crossing meant less time vulnerable to U-boat attack, less fuel consumption, faster reinforcement cycles. Calais also offered more direct routes into Germany once Allied forces broke out from the beaches. Allied planners built their deception on this geographic logic. They would convince Germany that the rational choice was the actual choice, that the Allies would invade at Calais because Calais made the most sense. The deception would work by appearing to confirm what German planners already believed. The 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG, was created as the centerpiece of the deception. On paper, FUSAG comprised approximately 50 divisions, making it larger than the actual invasion force that would land in Normandy. Führer was supposedly commanded by General George S. Patton, who German intelligence correctly assessed as America's most aggressive and capable commander. If Patton commanded Führer, German reasoning went, then Führer must be the main invasion force. But Führer existed only on paper, and in the careful construction of appearances meant to be observed by German intelligence. The Allies created physical evidence of Führer's existence in southeastern England, the area closest to Calais. They constructed dummy camps using tents and temporary structures that looked realistic from aerial reconnaissance. They positioned inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces in vehicle parks where German reconnaissance aircraft would photograph them. These inflatable decoys were remarkably convincing when viewed from altitude. They had the correct shape and size. They cast appropriate shadows. When German photo analysts studied reconnaissance images, they saw what appeared to be massive concentrations of armor and vehicles. The Allies positioned real equipment among the dummy equipment to maintain the deception if German agents somehow accessed the camps for close observation. A camp might have 99 inflatable tanks and one real tank. From the air, all 100 appeared genuine. If a German agent somehow penetrated the camp, they would find at least some real equipment, confirming that the camp was authentic rather than entirely false. Radio traffic was perhaps the most sophisticated element of the deception. Allied signals intelligence knew that Germany was intercepting and analyzing Allied radio communications. This capability could be exploited. Special radio units were created that broadcast entirely fictional communications using proper military protocols and codes. These units transmitted messages between non-existent divisions, headquarters that didn't exist, supply units that were pure invention. The communications followed realistic patterns. Requests for supplies, situation reports, routine administrative traffic, all the mundane communications that a real army would generate. The volume of traffic was carefully calculated to match what a 50-division force would actually produce. Too little traffic would suggest the force was smaller than claimed. Too much would seem suspicious. Allied signals specialists studied actual traffic volumes from real divisions and replicated those patterns for the fictional units. German signals intelligence intercepting this traffic had no reason to suspect it was false. It followed proper patterns, used correct codes, matched expected volumes. The Allies even created fake unit insignia, and included these insignia in documents that were deliberately allowed to be captured or observed. When German intelligence compiled information about Allied units in England, they built org charts showing Führer's structure, complete with division insignia, commanders' names, and locations. All of this information had been carefully provided through controlled sources. Double agents played a critical role in the deception. British counterintelligence had successfully captured or turned every German agent operating in Britain. These double agents continued sending reports to Germany, but the reports were crafted by British intelligence to support the deception. An agent might report observing troop trains moving into southeastern England, trains that actually carried real troops, but whose destination and purpose were misrepresented. Another agent might report conversations overheard at a pub where soldiers mentioned Calais. Conversations that were actually scripted and performed for the agent's benefit. The brilliance of using double agents was that Germany trusted these sources because the agents had been providing accurate information for months or years before the invasion. Their reports had been correct about other matters. Their credibility was established. When they reported on Führer and the apparent buildup opposite Calais, German intelligence had no reason to doubt them. The reports confirmed what aerial reconnaissance and signals intelligence were also indicating. General Patton's role in commanding Führer was itself a multi-layered deception. Patton was given a real headquarters with real staff officers in southeastern England. He made public appearances at Führer locations. He gave speeches to troops. German intelligence could verify through multiple sources that Patton was in southeastern England commanding a large force. This seemed to confirm Führer's reality and importance. Germany knew Patton's reputation. If the Americans were giving Patton command of Führer, it must be because Führer would be the main invasion force. What German intelligence didn't know was that Patton's assignment to Führer was temporary. He was actually being held in reserve to command the real Third Army, once it deployed to France after the Normandy invasion. But during the critical months before D-Day, Patton's presence with Führer served the deception perfectly. German intelligence drew exactly the conclusions the Allies wanted them to draw. The physical deception in England was complemented by deception in the Mediterranean. Operation Fortitude South focused on Calais, but Operation Fortitude North suggested that the Allies might also invade Norway. Fictional forces were supposedly assembled in Scotland. Radio traffic suggested preparations for amphibious operations in Scandinavia. This forced Germany to maintain defensive forces in Norway that might otherwise have been sent to France. The cumulative effect of these deception efforts was that German intelligence developed a completely false picture of Allied intentions. Their reports showed Führer with approximately 50 divisions opposite Calais, ready to invade across the narrowest part of the channel. The intelligence seemed reliable because it came from multiple independent sources: aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, agent reports, all confirming the same basic picture. Hitler received this intelligence and accepted it completely. It confirmed his own strategic assessment that Calais was the logical invasion point. It confirmed his belief that Germany's intelligence services were providing accurate information. The deception worked because it told Hitler what he already believed, using sources he trusted, with evidence that seemed overwhelmingly convincing. When the Normandy landings began on June 6th, Hitler interpreted them through this lens of pre-existing beliefs, supported by carefully constructed false intelligence. He believed he knew where the real invasion would come. He believed his intelligence about Führer was accurate. He believed Patton commanded the main invasion force, and Patton was still in England. Therefore, Normandy must be a diversion. A massive feint designed to draw German forces away from Calais before the real invasion struck. This interpretation wasn't irrational given what Hitler believed he knew. If Führer with 50 divisions was waiting opposite Calais, commanded by Patton, then it would be strategically foolish to commit all German reserves to defend Normandy and leave Calais vulnerable. Better to fight a delaying action in Normandy while maintaining strength at Calais, to defeat the main invasion when it came. The problem was that everything Hitler believed about Führer was false. The 50 divisions didn't exist. The tanks and vehicles were inflatables. The radio traffic was scripted. The agent reports were controlled by British intelligence. Patton's presence in southeastern England was temporary. The entire elaborate structure of intelligence that supported Hitler's beliefs was a carefully constructed lie, so well constructed that German intelligence couldn't detect the deception. Allied planners understood that the deception had to be maintained even after the actual invasion began. If Germany realized immediately that Normandy was the only invasion, they would commit all reserves to that battle. The goal was to keep Germany believing in the Calais threat for as long as possible, preventing commitment of reserves that could have made the Normandy battle more difficult. To maintain the deception after June 6th, Führer remained active in England. Radio traffic continued. Agent reports continued describing preparations for a second invasion. The Allies even staged elaborate preparations visible to German reconnaissance, suggesting that Führer was readying for follow-on operations. This sustained deception meant that even as the Normandy battle raged, German intelligence continued reporting that Führer in England appeared ready to launch the main invasion at Calais. Hitler maintained his belief in the Calais threat for 11 days after June 6th. During those 11 days, he kept significant forces defending Calais against an invasion that would never materialize. The Panzer divisions near Calais remained there, not committed to the actual battle in Normandy, because Hitler believed they would be needed to fight Führer when it landed. The mathematical cost of this sustained deception can be calculated with precision. Germany had approximately 20 divisions in the Calais area on June 6th, including multiple Panzer divisions. If even half of these forces had been committed to Normandy immediately after the invasion began, they would have substantially increased German strength in the actual battle. Whether this would have defeated the invasion is debatable, but it would certainly have made the battle more costly for the Allies. By keeping these forces defending against a fictional threat for 11 days, the deception ensured that when they were finally released to move to Normandy, the battle there was already decided. The Allies had established an unbreakable foothold. The deception's value wasn't just in causing the initial delays on June 6th. It was in sustaining those delays for over a week, while the Allied position grew stronger daily. This is what made Operation Fortitude historically significant. It wasn't just that it fooled German intelligence initially. It was that it continued to fool German leadership, even after the real invasion had begun, even after the evidence that Normandy was the actual invasion became overwhelming. Hitler's psychological commitment to his belief in Calais, a commitment based on intelligence that seemed impeccable, but was actually carefully constructed deception, prevented him from adjusting his strategy, even when adjustment was desperately needed. His senior officers attempted to present alternative interpretations. Could this be the actual invasion? Could Calais be the diversion? The scale of the Normandy operation suggested it was too large to be merely a feint. But Hitler was convinced. His intelligence about Calais was too detailed, too consistent, too convincing to be false. The Allies must be counting on him reacting to Normandy and weakening Calais. He wouldn't fall for it. This psychological commitment to a pre-existing belief, even in the face of contradictory evidence, would prove as costly as the delay caused by his sleep. Even if Hitler had been awakened at 0400 hours, if he'd maintained the same interpretation that Normandy was a diversion, the result would have been similar delays in committing reserves. The sleep delay and the strategic misinterpretation combined to create a catastrophic failure of German response. At 10:45 hours, Hitler authorized limited movement of some reserve units toward Normandy, but he explicitly refused to release the Panzer divisions from the Calais area. Those divisions would remain positioned to counter the real invasion when it came. Field commanders requesting immediate armored support were told that reserves couldn't be committed until the situation was clarified. General Leo Geyer von Schweppenburg, commanding Panzer Group West, received these orders with barely concealed frustration. He had been ready to move his divisions toward Normandy at 0400 hours if authorization had been given. Now, 7 hours later, he was still waiting for permission to commit forces. And even the limited movements authorized were inadequate. The divisions being released were infantry divisions that would take days to reach the battlefield. The Panzer divisions, the only forces capable of reaching Normandy quickly enough to matter, remained held in reserve against an invasion that would never come. Von Rundstedt, as overall commander in the West, had nominal authority over forces in France, but his authority had been systematically undermined by Hitler's insertion of OKW into the chain of command. Major decisions required Hitler's approval. Reserves couldn't be committed without OKW authorization. This divided command structure, where field marshals commanded in name, but Hitler controlled in practice, guaranteed that decisions would be delayed while requests traveled up the chain of command were debated by OKW staff and eventually reached Hitler for final approval. On June 6, 1944, this command structure's inadequacies were exposed with mathematical precision. Every stage of the decision process consumed time. Von Rundstedt's request at 0400 hours had to be communicated to OKW. OKW staff had to debate whether to wake Hitler. When Hitler finally woke at 0945 hours, he had to be briefed on the situation. The briefing took time to prepare and deliver. Hitler then had to consider the information and make decisions. Those decisions had to be communicated back down the chain of command. Each stage consumed 30 minutes to an hour. The cumulative delay was catastrophic. By noon on June 6th, the Allies had approximately 75,000 troops ashore. They controlled beachheads extending several kilometers inland. They had linked most of the separate landing beaches into a continuous front. Engineers had cleared beach obstacles and created routes for vehicles and artillery to move inland. The invasion had succeeded. Whether it could still be defeated through immediate counterattack was becoming questionable. At 1300 hours, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel reached his headquarters in France. Rommel had been in Germany on June 5th, visiting his wife for her birthday. The weather had been poor throughout early June, with storms predicted to continue for several days. Rommel had assessed that invasion was unlikely during this weather window, and had taken the opportunity to visit his wife and then travel to Hitler's headquarters to request additional resources for coastal defenses. When he received word that the invasion had begun, he immediately started the return journey to France, but the travel consumed critical hours. Rommel was arguably Germany's most competent commander in France. He understood mobile warfare better than most German generals. He had predicted months earlier that the Allies would land in Normandy if they had sufficient strength, and he'd requested that Panzer divisions be positioned close to the coast where they could counterattack quickly. Hitler had overruled Rommel's recommendations. Hitler believed that Panzer divisions held too far forward would be vulnerable to naval gunfire and air attack. Better to hold them inland where they could respond to wherever the invasion came. This disagreement about armor deployment had been ongoing for months. Now, on June 6th, events were proving Rommel correct and Hitler wrong. But Rommel wasn't present to push for immediate commitment of armor. He was traveling back to France, unable to influence decisions being made at OKW. When Rommel arrived at his headquarters at 1300 hours and was briefed on the situation, and on Hitler's assessment that Normandy was a diversion, his response was reportedly a mixture of frustration and resignation. He knew the Panzer divisions needed to move immediately. He knew that Hitler's obsession with Calais was based on successful Allied deception, but he also knew that arguing with Hitler was futile once the Führer had made up his mind. Rommel could request, could present evidence, could make tactical arguments. But if Hitler had decided that Calais was the real objective, no amount of evidence about Normandy would change his assessment. At 1500 hours, 11 hours after the first landing craft hit the beaches, Hitler finally authorized the 12th SS Panzer Division to move toward Normandy. This was one of the two divisions von Rundstedt had requested at 0400 hours. One division, 11 hours late. The Panzer Lehr Division remained held in reserve. Other armored divisions further from Normandy remained positioned to defend Calais. The 12th SS Panzer Division began its movement toward Normandy, immediately upon receiving orders. But the division faced challenges that hadn't existed at 0400 hours, when movement was first requested. Allied air superiority was now total. Fighter bombers patrolled the skies over France continuously. Any German vehicle movement during daylight was detected and attacked. The division would have to move primarily at night to avoid air attack, which would slow its advance significantly. Moreover, the division needed fuel for its movement. German logistics in France were strained. The Allied strategic bombing campaign had disrupted French rail networks. Road transport was vulnerable to air attack. Getting sufficient fuel forward to supply a division's movement toward Normandy required time and exposed supply columns to air attack. The division's supply officers estimated it would take 24 to 36 hours to reach the Normandy area, not the 8 to 10 hours that would have been possible with his 0400 hours start. By 1600 hours, Allied forces had over 100,000 troops ashore. They had secured all their initial objectives. They were advancing inland. German forces defending the beaches were falling back to prepared positions further inland. The opportunity for a counterattack that could reach the beaches and engage landing craft was gone. Any counterattack now would be fighting inland, against established Allied positions, under constant air attack. At 1800 hours, as the June sun was beginning to set over Normandy, Hitler held another conference with his staff. He received updated reports from the battlefield. The numbers were stark. Allied forces controlled approximately 50 kilometers of coastline. They had landed 6 divisions. They had established supply routes across the beaches. Naval gunfire was supporting Allied advances inland. Air superiority was complete, with German fighters unable to contest the airspace over the battlefield. Hitler's response to these reports was to reiterate his conviction that Calais remained the primary threat. Normandy might be larger than expected, might be more than a simple diversion, but the main invasion would still come at Calais. Germany must maintain strength there. The panzer divisions defending Calais could not be released to fight in Normandy. General Alfred Jodl, who had stood outside Hitler's bedroom door that morning afraid to knock, now sat in this evening conference and listened to Hitler's analysis with the growing realization that Germany had lost the war. Not because German soldiers had failed to fight effectively, not because German weapons were inferior, but because the command structure had proven incapable of making timely decisions. Because Hitler's sleep schedule had cost 6 critical hours. Because Hitler's certainty about Calais, a certainty based on successful enemy deception, prevented commitment of reserves that might have defeated the invasion. Jodl had served in the German military for decades. He understood military operations, logistics, timing. He could calculate as well as any staff officer what the delays had cost. If the Panzer divisions had moved at 400 hours, they would have reached the battlefield by 1400 hours. They would have hit Allied forces that were still organizing, still vulnerable, still capable of being pushed back. The probability of successfully defeating the invasion wasn't high. The Allies had massive advantages in naval gunfire and air power, but there was a chance, perhaps a 10 to 20% chance, that an immediate armored counterattack could have disrupted Allied operations sufficiently to force a withdrawal. By moving at 1500 hours, 11 hours late, those divisions would reach the battlefield by tomorrow afternoon at the earliest, given the need to move at night to avoid air attack. By then the Allies would have 200,000 troops ashore, would have armor and artillery deployed, would have integrated air support. The probability of a successful counterattack would be essentially zero. The 11-hour delay had transformed a difficult but possible operation into an impossible one, and that 11-hour delay had been caused by a 6-hour sleep delay plus a 5-hour decision delay. 6 hours because nobody dared wake Hitler until he woke naturally. 5 hours because even after waking, Hitler had to be briefed, had to analyze the situation through the distorting lens of his pre-existing beliefs about Calais, had to debate with advisors, and had to make decisions that he was temperamentally unwilling to delegate. This is what made June 6, 1944, such a catastrophic failure of German military leadership. It wasn't a failure of courage or determination. German soldiers fighting on the beaches demonstrated both. It wasn't a failure of weapons or equipment. German defensive positions were formidable where they existed. It was a failure of command structure and decision-making, a failure that could be quantified in hours and kilometers, in calculations of movement rates and arrival times, in probabilities that shifted from possible to impossible because of delays that were entirely self-inflicted. The evening of June 6th passed into night. Allied forces consolidated their positions, brought in more supplies, prepared for German counterattacks that would surely come tomorrow. German forces fell back to secondary defensive lines, established strongpoints, requested reinforcement and ammunition that was slow to arrive because supply routes were under air attack. The 12th SS Panzer Division continued its movement toward Normandy, moving at night, hiding during the day, making slower progress than planned. The division's commander knew that by the time his tanks reached the battlefield, the situation would have changed dramatically from what had existed that morning. What might have been a counterattack to stop an invasion would become a counterattack against an established Allied presence. On June 7th, the second day of the invasion, Hitler continued to maintain that Calais remained the primary threat. He authorized movement of additional divisions toward Normandy, but always with the caveat that sufficient forces must remain to defend Calais. The Panzer divisions in the Calais area, the strongest armored forces Germany had in France, remained positioned to counter an invasion that would never materialize. By June 8th, the Allies had nearly 300,000 troops ashore. They controlled a beachhead approximately 80 kilometers wide and 15 to 20 kilometers deep. German counterattacks were launched as divisions arrived piecemeal. But these attacks were uncoordinated, unsupported by adequate air cover, and achieved only limited tactical success at prohibitive cost. The 12th SS Panzer Division finally reached the Normandy area on June 7th and launched its first major attack on June 8th. The division fought effectively, demonstrating the quality of German armor and training, but the division was attacking alone, without support from other armored divisions. Allied air power was overwhelming. The division took heavy casualties from air attack. By June 9th, The division had been stopped, having gained little ground at severe cost. If this same division had reached the battlefield on June 6th at 1400 hours, as would have been possible with orders issued at 400 hours, it would have been attacking Allied forces that lacked the air superiority and artillery support they possessed by June 8th. The outcome might still have been failure. The Allies were powerful and well prepared. But the probability of success would have been orders of magnitude higher than what was possible by June 8th. This is the mathematical reality that Hitler's sleep and subsequent indecision had created. Not impossible tasks made slightly harder, but possible tasks made impossible. A 6-hour delay in the morning, plus a 5-hour delay in making decisions, plus the subsequent delays in movement during which Allied strength grew exponentially, had transformed the military situation from difficult but possible to essentially hopeless. Field Marshal Rommel understood this mathematics with painful clarity. On June 9th, after watching the 12th SS Panzer Division's attack fail despite the bravery of the troops involved, Rommel sent a frank assessment to OKW. He stated that Germany could not win the battle in Normandy. Allied superiority in men, material, and especially air power was too great. The only question was how long German forces could delay the inevitable Allied breakout from Normandy. Hitler's response to this assessment was to order Rommel to hold every meter of ground. There would be no withdrawal. German forces would fight for every village and field. This order reflected Hitler's consistent pattern of refusing to acknowledge military reality. Rather than accepting that the invasion had succeeded and adjusting strategy accordingly, Hitler insisted on fighting a battle that couldn't be won because accepting defeat would mean acknowledging his errors. The errors were multiple and compounding. The error of sleeping through the critical hours when immediate decisions were necessary. The error of creating a command structure where officers feared to wake him because his temper was more dangerous to their careers than enemy action. The error of insisting that Calais remained the real target, despite overwhelming evidence that Normandy was the actual invasion. The error of refusing to commit armor reserves until it was too late for them to matter. The error of maintaining this rigid assessment for days after the invasion began, preventing concentration of forces that might have made the battle more effective, even if ultimate victory was unlikely. Each error individually was serious. Combined, they were catastrophic. And they were all self-inflicted, the result of command decisions and personality characteristics that could have been different. On June 17th, 11 days after the invasion began, Hitler finally acknowledged that Normandy was the main invasion, and that no second landing at Calais would occur. He authorized the movement of panzer divisions from the Calais area to Normandy. But by this time, the Allies had over 500,000 troops ashore. The beachhead extended for over 100 kilometers of coastline. Allied air superiority was absolute. The panzer divisions that might have made a difference on June 6th were irrelevant by June 17th. The belated commitment of these divisions demonstrated the cost of Hitler's 11-day delay in accepting reality. If the divisions had moved on June 6th, they would have engaged Allied forces while they were still establishing positions. By June 17th, they were attacking an Allied position that had become a fortress. The divisions took catastrophic casualties from air attack during their movement to Normandy. Those that survived to reach the battlefield launched attacks that achieved nothing beyond adding to the casualty lists. Major General Alfred Jodl, watching this unfold from OKW headquarters, understood that he had witnessed a turning point in the war. Not the dramatic turning point of a major battle won or lost through courage and sacrifice, but the bureaucratic turning point of an organization so dysfunctional that it couldn't make timely decisions even when survival depended on speed. Jodl had stood outside Hitler's bedroom door on the morning of June 6th and failed to knock. This failure, multiplied by hundreds of similar failures by officers throughout the command structure, who had learned that Hitler's displeasure was more to be feared than enemy action, had created a military organization incapable of responding effectively to rapidly developing situations. The Wehrmacht could plan carefully, could prepare elaborate operations given sufficient time. But it couldn't improvise, couldn't react quickly, couldn't make decisions at the speed modern warfare required. In July 1944, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler, planting a bomb at his headquarters in East Prussia. The assassination failed, and Hitler survived with relatively minor injuries. But the very fact that senior military officers, men who had sworn personal oaths of loyalty to Hitler, felt compelled to attempt killing their supreme commander demonstrated how completely Hitler's leadership had failed in their eyes. These officers saw that Hitler was leading Germany to destruction, that his military judgments were consistently wrong, that his refusal to delegate authority or accept advice from professional military officers was costing German lives daily. The officers who planned and executed the July 20th assassination attempt included veterans who had observed Hitler's decision-making on June 6th and in the weeks that followed. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, who placed the bomb at Hitler's headquarters, had served on the general staff and had access to detailed information about how strategic decisions were made, or more accurately, how they were delayed and distorted by Hitler's involvement. Stauffenberg and the other conspirators understood that Germany couldn't win the war with Hitler's leadership. They had watched too many situations where militarily necessary decisions were delayed or avoided because of Hitler's sleep schedule, his psychological rigidity, his inability to accept unpleasant realities. The planning for the assassination had begun in early 1944, before the Normandy invasion. But the events of June 6th and the following weeks had intensified the conspirators' sense of urgency. They had watched Hitler sleep through the critical hours when immediate decisions could have made a difference. They had watched him maintain his belief in the Calais threat for 11 days, despite overwhelming evidence that Normandy was the real invasion. They had watched him refuse to authorize strategic withdrawals, even when holding positions was militarily pointless and costly. They understood that every additional month that Hitler remained in power meant hundreds of thousands of additional German deaths in a war that couldn't be won. Whether killing Hitler would have changed Germany's strategic situation by July 1944 is debatable among historians. By that point, Germany faced overwhelming Allied forces in the West and Soviet forces in the East. The material advantages the Allies possessed in terms of industrial production, manpower, and resources were so great that German defeat was probably inevitable regardless of who commanded German forces. But the conspirators believed that removing Hitler might allow Germany to negotiate a peace settlement that would prevent total destruction. With Hitler gone, perhaps a new German government could approach the Western Allies about an armistice, could at least end the war before Germany was completely devastated. The assassination attempt failed through a combination of circumstances. Stauffenberg placed the bomb in a briefcase positioned near Hitler during a conference at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. The bomb detonated as planned, killing 4 people in the conference room. But Hitler survived because the conference table's heavy oak construction partially shielded him from the blast, and because someone had inadvertently moved Stauffenberg's briefcase slightly further from Hitler moments before the explosion. Hitler suffered burst eardrums, some burns, and minor injuries, but nothing life-threatening. The failure of the assassination had catastrophic consequences for the conspirators and for the German officer corps more broadly. Hitler ordered immediate and brutal retribution. Stauffenberg was executed by firing squad that same night. Other conspirators were arrested, subjected to show trials before the People's Court, where they had no genuine opportunity to defend themselves, and then executed, often by hanging with piano wire to ensure a slow, painful death. Hitler ordered that some executions be filmed, so he could watch them repeatedly. But the purge extended beyond the immediate conspirators. Hitler's paranoia, always present but intensified by the assassination attempt, led him to suspect wide circles of the military officer corps. Field Marshal Rommel, who had not been directly involved in the plot, but who had been in contact with some conspirators, was forced to commit suicide rather than face trial and the certain execution that would follow. Other officers who had any connection to the conspirators, even indirect connections, were arrested and interrogated. Some were executed. Others were dismissed from service. The purge removed many of Germany's most capable and experienced officers, from positions of command. The aftermath of the failed assassination also intensified Hitler's control over military operations. He had always been suspicious of his generals, believing that they lacked the vision and determination that he possessed. After July 20th, this suspicion became paranoia. Hitler trusted his generals even less than before. He insisted on more direct control over operational decisions. Commanders in the field found that their authority was further restricted. Decisions that should have been made at army group or army level were referred to Hitler, his headquarters, for approval. The delays that had plagued German military operations since the beginning of the war became worse. The contrast between Hitler's command style and Allied command style was stark and consequential. Allied commanders like Eisenhower, Montgomery, Bradley, and Patton had substantial authority to make tactical and operational decisions without constantly referring to political leadership for approval. Eisenhower, as Supreme Commander Allied Expeditionary Force, could make decisions about how to employ forces in France without calling Winston Churchill or Franklin Roosevelt for permission. This meant that when situations changed on the battlefield, Allied forces could respond quickly, adapting their tactics to circumstances without waiting for authorization from distant headquarters. German commanders lacked this flexibility. After the Normandy invasion, as Allied forces broke out from the beachhead and began advancing across France, German field commanders repeatedly requested authorization for tactical withdrawals to establish defensive lines at more defensible positions. These requests made military sense. Trying to hold every position regardless of strategic value meant that German forces were defeated in detail, destroyed piecemeal without accomplishing any larger defensive objective. Better to withdraw to defensible positions, preserve German strength, and force the Allies to attack prepared defenses rather than continuing to advance almost unopposed. But Hitler refused almost all requests for withdrawal. His orders were to hold every position, to defend every village and town, to give up no ground voluntarily. These orders reflected his psychological inability to accept that Germany was losing. Withdrawal meant acknowledging that German forces were weaker than the enemy, that defensive positions could be lost, that the tide of war had turned decisively against Germany. Hitler couldn't accept this psychologically, so he ordered his forces to stand and fight in positions that couldn't be held, ensuring that German units were destroyed in battles that achieved nothing strategically. The cumulative cost of these orders was catastrophic. German divisions that might have been preserved by timely withdrawal were instead destroyed in hopeless defensive battles. The equipment and trained personnel that Germany desperately needed for defending the approaches to Germany itself were wasted holding French villages that had no strategic importance. By the time Allied forces reached Germany's borders in September 1944, the German army in the West had been bled white by Hitler's refusal to allow strategic withdrawals. Historians studying the Normandy campaign and the subsequent Allied advance across France have calculated what different German strategic choices might have achieved. If Germany had authorized immediate commitment of Panzer reserves on June 6th, the invasion might have been defeated, or at least contested more effectively, though the Allies' advantages in air power and naval gunfire made German success unlikely. If Germany had recognized that Normandy was the actual invasion by June 7th, and committed all available forces to the battle, the fighting would have been more intense and Allied casualties would have been higher, though ultimate Allied success was still probable. But if Germany had abandoned the Normandy region after it became clear the position couldn't be held, if German forces had conducted fighting withdrawals to prepared defensive positions closer to Germany, they could have preserved significant combat power. The battles to cross France and reach Germany's borders would have been more difficult for the Allies if they'd faced organized German resistance at successive defensive lines rather than disorganized remnants of defeated units. Hitler's refusal to allow this kind of strategic flexibility meant that Germany fought the wrong battles in the wrong places at the wrong times. Forces were committed to hopeless defensive positions and destroyed. Withdrawals that would have preserved combat power were forbidden. The opportunity to trade space for time, to conduct a strategic defense that might have delayed Allied advances and forced them to fight more costly battles, was lost because Hitler's psychological need to appear strong, to never retreat, to maintain the fiction of German superiority, prevented sound military strategy. The pattern established on June 6th, where Hitler's personal characteristics prevented effective military decision-making, continued throughout the remainder of the war. His sleep schedule continued to cause delays, though after the Normandy invasion, the Allies were rarely stopped by delays measured in hours. His refusal to delegate authority continued to constrain German commanders. His psychological rigidity continued to prevent strategic adjustments that might have made battles more difficult for the Allies. In December 1944, 6 months after the Normandy invasion, Hitler launched Germany's last major offensive in the West, the Ardennes offensive, commonly known as the Battle of the Bulge. This operation reflected many of the same command pathologies that had plagued German operations on June 6th. Hitler personally designed the operational plan, overruling objections from field commanders who believed the operation was too ambitious given Germany's limited resources. The plan required capturing American fuel supplies because Germany lacked sufficient fuel to support the operation from its own resources. The plan assumed that German armor could advance rapidly through the Ardennes region, despite poor road conditions and winter weather. The operation achieved initial surprise and made substantial gains in its first few days. But the fundamental assumptions underlying the plan were flawed. German forces didn't capture the American fuel supplies they needed. The road network couldn't support the rapid movement the plan required. American forces recovered from their initial surprise more quickly than German planning assumed. And critically, when the operation stalled and field commanders requested authorization for tactical withdrawals to preserve forces, Hitler refused. He insisted that the offensive continue, that forces push forward despite lacking the supplies and support needed for success. The result was that Germany committed its last strategic reserves to an operation that failed, destroying forces that could have been used to defend Germany against the Soviet advance in the east. The Ardennes offensive demonstrated that Hitler had learned nothing from June 6th. He was still overruling professional military advice, still refusing to acknowledge limitations, still insisting on operations that made poor strategic sense, still forbidding withdrawals even when positions were clearly untenable. By April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Hitler was still issuing orders to non-existent divisions, still moving phantom armies on maps that bore no relationship to reality, still refusing to acknowledge that Germany had lost the war. His detachment from reality was complete. But the patterns that led to this detachment, the psychological characteristics that prevented him from accepting unpleasant facts or adjusting strategies based on evidence, these had been visible on June 6, 1944, when he insisted that Normandy was a diversion, despite overwhelming evidence that it was the actual invasion. The mathematical calculation of what Hitler's sleep and subsequent decisions cost Germany on June 6 can be stated precisely. The 6-hour sleep delay plus the 5-hour decision delay plus the 11-day delay in committing forces from Calais meant that German counterattacks occurred after Allied positions had become strong enough to defeat them. The probability of German success, never high given Allied advantages, dropped from perhaps 10 to 20% if counterattacks had been launched at 1400 hours on June 6 to essentially zero when counterattacks were launched days later against an established Allied presence supported by overwhelming air power. This quantifiable failure of decision-making, where delays that can be measured in hours transformed possible operations into impossible ones, represents one of history's clearest examples of how command structure failures can determine military outcomes, regardless of the bravery or capability of individual soldiers and units. German soldiers fought effectively in Normandy. German weapons were often superior to Allied equivalents in one-on-one engagements, but German command structure was so dysfunctional that these advantages couldn't be exploited effectively. The assassination attempt failed. Hitler survived, and the officers involved were executed after show trials. But Hitler's survival didn't change the reality that had been established on June 6. The Allied invasion had succeeded. The beachhead in Normandy became a base for over 2 million Allied troops. From this base, Allied forces broke out into France in August, liberated Paris by the end of August, and advanced toward Germany's borders by September. The war would continue for 11 more months after D-Day. German forces would fight effectively in many battles, demonstrating that individual German soldiers and units remained formidable even in defeat. But the strategic situation had become hopeless. Germany was being ground down by enemies on all sides, and that strategic hopelessness traced back to specific decisions and delays that could be calculated mathematically. 6 hours of sleep delay, 5 hours of decision delay, 11 days of refusing to acknowledge reality. These weren't abstract failures of judgment. These were precise, quantifiable delays that could be measured in hours, and compared to movement rates and building rates, and the mathematical certainty that every hour of delay made German success less probable and eventually impossible. This is what Hitler said when he heard D-Day had begun. He said it was a diversion. He said Calais remained the real target. He said German forces must hold their positions defending against an invasion that would never come. These words reflected his inability to abandon a belief he'd held for months, even when evidence overwhelmingly contradicted that belief. And this psychological rigidity, combined with the delays his sleep schedule imposed, created a catastrophic failure of military leadership. But perhaps more significant than what Hitler said was what he didn't say. He didn't say, "Move the Panzer divisions immediately." He didn't say, "I was wrong about Calais." He didn't say, "We must commit all available forces to defeat this invasion in the next 24 hours. These were the things he should have said. These were the orders that might have given Germany a chance, however slim, of defeating the invasion. Instead, he maintained his existing beliefs, trusted his pre-existing convictions over current evidence, and made decisions that guaranteed the invasion's success. And he did this because his command style, his temperament, his refusal to delegate or trust subordinates, and his conviction that his intuition was superior to professional military analysis, all combined to make sound military decision-making impossible. June 6, 1944. Major General Alfred Jodl stood outside Hitler's bedroom door at 06:15 hours and chose not to knock. That choice, multiplied by countless similar choices throughout the German command structure, ensured that when Hitler finally woke at 09:45 hours, the mathematical window for effective response had already closed. The invasion would succeed not primarily because of Allied strength or German weakness, but because Germany's command structure was so dysfunctional that it couldn't respond at the speed that modern warfare demanded. What Hitler said when he heard D-Day had begun was less important than what he didn't say, less important than the hours he slept while history was being written, less important than the psychological rigidity that prevented him from acknowledging errors, even when those errors were destroying his nation. This wasn't a failure of military capability. This was a failure of leadership that could be measured in hours and kilometers and probabilities, a failure so complete that historians would study it for decades as a case study in how command structures fail when power is centralized in one individual whose judgment is consistently wrong. The dark lesson of D-Day for Germany wasn't that the Allies were too strong. It was that Germany's own command structure had made defeat inevitable. Hitler's sleep schedule, his temperament, his refusal to delegate, his psychological rigidity, all the characteristics that had allowed him to seize absolute power, made him incapable of exercising that power effectively when speed and flexibility were required. And on June 6, 1944, that incapacity transformed a difficult Allied invasion into an unstoppable success, not through any decision Hitler made after waking, but through the hours he spent sleeping, while the decisions that mattered were made by default through inaction.